Fortunately, the times of events that are prophesied in the Bible are expressed in terms of their occurrence relative to one another, rather than in terms of dates on human calendars. Humans in different cultures have used many different calendars over the ages. Even the enumerated spans of time in Bible prophecy are anchored to events rather than to dates. Provided that we know the sequential order in which a set of events is foretold to occur, it is not essential for us to map those events to specific dates according to any particular dating system. If we observe that certain events in the sequence have occurred, we know enough to anticipate the next events on the prophetic timeline. To this extent, Bible prophecy has inbuilt protection against chronological tampering. It makes sense that prophecy is laid out in this way, as God's clearly intended purposes of including prophecy in Scripture are to evince that He is the one true God who alone knows the end from the beginning, as well as to enable us to know something of things to come. It is hardly imaginable to me that God would allow for a situation in which His own purposes would not be achieved. Although manipulation of the historical timeline could theoretically have the effect of distorting our perception of how much of a prophesied length of time has passed, would that not defeat God's purposes, and should we accept that He has in any way conceded defeat? If the supposed intention of altering the historical timeline is to prevent us from correctly gauging the passage of some enumerated interval of time in Bible prophecy, would it not be more practicable and efficient for the perpetrators to alter prophecy itself to achieve that? Surely, all of the genuine written historical records that would need to be located, seized, and either edited or destroyed, along with the new records that would need to be forged, in order to credibly fabricate centuries of history, would outnumber all of the paper Bibles in existence. If a group of conspirators hundreds of years ago had undertaken to accomplish this ominous feat, they would at least have found Bibles to be a more readily identifiable and isolatable target than the unfathomable assortment of books, documents, personal letters, and other written materials that might contain statements exposing the continuity of historical events that they were trying to hide. Rather than engaging in a hit-or-miss operation involving the sifting through all manner of documents, why would they not have saved themselves considerable time and trouble by plotting to destroy or revise Bibles instead? To this question, some might reply that God would not allow for His word to be summarily changed. To that I would agree, and I suspect that the multiplicity of Hebrew and Greek manuscripts that has found its way down to us through time attests to this. They serve as redundant copies. If one or another has been altered, we are able to detect that by a comparison to other existing manuscripts. However, that answer, in turn, would still beg the question of why God would not allow His word to be so changed. To that question, some might respond that it is because God intends for His people to continue to be able to know, understand, and believe His original words. As God's prophetic words predict future earthly events, and so the occurrences of those events mirror and authenticate the truth of His prophetic words, would not God preserve our ability to perceive those earthly events as occurring in accordance with what He has said? If not, and He had allowed the historical timeline to be altered to an extent that we could no longer do so, would the final result have been any different than if He had allowed His own words to be summarily changed? No. And thus we circle back to the question of whether we should accept that God's purposes can be defeated. In any case, what actual harm would be done by making Christians believe that they were living at a time, say, 700 years later than they actually were? If true, it would put those of us deceived into believing it is now 2025 in the actual year 1325. If one might answer that this deception was meant to prevent us from seeing that we are in Satan's little season by obscuring the fact of how recently the prophesied millennium ended, I would point out how very few Christians in the present day believe that the millennium is past anyway, which would make that a rather moot proposition. But they might have believed so, if the timeline hadn't been altered, might be the rebuttal, the logic of which conjecture I would not fathom, but in response to which, I would still point out that even the Reformation-era Calvinist Protestants who thought that the millennium had ended a few centuries before their time did not believe that they were still in Satan's little season. Not that I believe that what those reformers believed about the timing of the millennium and little season carries any weight, but it is something to consider. I do dedicate a great deal of space later, though, to an exploration of why they believed what they did, even in spite of real circumstances that were very much opposed to such an interpretation, because that is important to the discussion. Returning to the question of damage caused by an extension of the historical timeline, it is important to realize that none of the majority eschatological views held by most Christians is currently counting down years on any prophetic clock. Each of these positions considers the most recent enumerated prophetic time period that it regards as relevant, if any, as having either concluded or had its clock stopped, so to speak, back in the 1st century. Those that anticipate further enumerated prophetic time to unfold expect it to either begin or resume at an undetermined moment in the future. Therefore, no addition of false time to chronology since the latter part of the 1st century until now would be of any consequence to them. Even most adherents of historic premillennialism, who are a rare breed today, do not see our present as part of any prophesied length of time with an expiration date. The historicists base their identification of the start and end of the prophesied period of supremacy of the little horn of Daniel 7 and first beast of Revelation, from the early 6th or early 7th centuries to the late 18th or mid-19th centuries, primarily on events at the two extremes of that time period. These events themselves, which occurred when expected in accordance with the prophesied span of years, actually tend to confirm the integrity of the overall historical timeline. This will be elaborated later. Revelation 20 verses 7-9 says that, for a short time after the prophesied millennium, Satan deceives peoples, tribes, multitudes, to gather them to battle, and that this leads to their besieging the camp of the saints. As little season eschatology would have us understand it, I gather, while acknowledging that the views of individual adherents may vary, either we Christians living now are the saints, who Revelation implies are in the camp of the saints during Satan's little season, or we are a group of Christians distinct from those in the camp. Whichever the case may be, most of us are deceived along with the rest regarding the year we are living in. For this reason, presumably unless we recognize this deception, we will join with all the rest in besieging what is either our own camp or the camp of our Christian brethren. Is it really supposed that this is Satan's final deception? As I will later show, it is not so much a logic that leads to this frayed conclusion, as a fault in interpreting prophecy that starts at the rejection of history. This compels the little seasonist to accept whatever conclusion logically follows from interpreting prophecy under that pretext. The aim of Satan's deception of the masses during the little season is undoubtedly the same result as usual, to redirect worship away from God and toward himself, in some form or another. The mode of the deception is just as likely the same as that employed by the false prophet before the millennium, Revelation 13 verses 13-14, 19 verse 20, to cause the people to receive the mark and worship the image, by using fire from heaven. That is to say, miraculous signs such as God once showed with Elijah in 1 Kings 18 verses 38-39, to convince them that he is their true God. Note that the masses whom Satan deceives in his little season are none other than the rest of the dead, that are said to emerge from within the earth at the end of the millennium, Revelation 20 verse 5, verses 8-9. His deception, very plausibly, begins with claiming credit for the miracle of their resurrection which is actually effected by God. Explained in the chapter, Satan's Little Season, a Scriptural View. Little seasonists like Mr. Jack may point to the claims of crypto-historicists, such as Gunnar Heinsohn, Heribert Illig and Anatoly Fomenko, in support of their belief that the historical timeline has been artificially extended. Now, I will not spend the time to read the volumes of these men's writings and attempt to refute their discoveries. I neither have the academic background that qualifies me to judge their findings, nor am I the type who is content to simply sit back and trust the science, but neither do I feel that refuting them is necessary. This is because of my conviction, intimated above, that God would not permit the distortion of human history to such an extent that his people would be prevented from seeing prophecy unfold as Scripture has foretold. It is enough for my present purpose to know how these scholars' claims inform the beliefs of little seasonists. Mr. Jack says that Gunnar Heinsohn, through his study of stratigraphy, concluded that what are asserted by scientists to have been 3 distinct natural calamities that occurred in different regions of the European continent in the 3rd, 6th, and 10th centuries were actually a single event. If that is what Mr. Heinsohn discovered and he was correct, then kudos to him. Nonetheless, the realization that some scientists were mistaken in their reckoning that 3 events occurred over 3 centuries when, in reality, it was one event that occurred in just one of those centuries, does not make the other 2 centuries disappear. If one wanted to adduce this as evidence that it does, one would also need to demonstrate that historians used these findings to falsify historical records. I have seen Mr. Jack make only a passing reference to Heribert Illig. I find for myself that Illig proposed that 300 years had been added to history, based on his claim that the number of days needed, in the year 1582, to bring the Gregorian calendar into alignment with the Julian calendar, should have been 13, whereas it was, in fact, only 10. That discrepant 3 days would have reflected a procession of equinoxes that was worth 3 unaccounted centuries. However, the confusion is resolved with the understanding that the Gregorian calendar was not aligned to the Julian calendar at its inception in 45 BC, as Illig thought, but rather to the Julian calendar as it stood in 325 AD. As for Anatoly Fomenko, I see that he did make some intriguing observations in comparing the chronologies of dynasties, including the Second Roman Empire with the Third, the Israelite Kingdom with the Western Roman Empire, the Judean Kingdom with the Eastern Roman Empire, and one epoch of the Roman papacy with another. He discovered a good number of uncanny parallels between the particulars of each dynasty with the other, including names, circumstances, and the natures, sequences, and durations of events. He made side-by-side comparisons of these chronologies to illustrate the similarities. He paralleled the life of Jesus Christ with that of Saint Basil, stating that legends about him are identical to the ones told about Jesus Christ, and asserted that the latter was a phantom reflection of the former. He said that the Second and Third Roman Empires never actually existed but were only phantom reflections of a much later medieval kingdom. Although the parallels that Fomenko showed are thought-provoking, I believe he went too far in asserting that they serve as evidence of historians having made up entire dynastic histories modeled on those of other dynasties that did actually exist, in order to add hundreds of years to history. It seems unlikely to me that it would ever cross the mind of a mathematician educated in Soviet Russia, but, coming from a Christian viewpoint, I think a more plausible explanation for what appears to be a rough replication of the history of Israelite kingdoms in the Roman empires, that of an earlier Roman empire in a later one, and of that of one Roman papal epoch in a next one, is that originality is not Satan's forte. Diabolissimia Dei, it has been said, the devil imitates God. As an angel, he was not designed for the purpose of creating. His imitative mode of creating is summarized well by Preterism and Vitreich in their book, The Apocalypse in English Renaissance Thought and Literature. The tradition in asserting Satan's parody of the activities of God reaches back to the New Testament, partly to St. Paul's prophecy of the advent of Antichrist. He is God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4. But especially to the series of parodies enacted by the forces of darkness in the book of Revelation, the dragon's bestowal of great authority in the style appropriate solely to Christ, 13 verse 2. The ominous figure seated on a white horse in imitation of Christ similarly astraddle, 6 verse 2. 19 verses 11 to 13, and particularly the congregated essays of the demonic trinity, the dragon, the first beast, and the second beast, to be a false god, a false Christ, and a false prophet. It should come as no surprise if Satan loosely patterned the chronology of his Roman beast system after that of God's original covenant people, the Israelites, or if this pattern appears to repeat in each successive phase of that Roman system through time. The little Seasonists recognize the Roman Empire as the beast, and according to Scripture the beast is empowered, enthroned and authorized by Satan. I will later show that the Roman papacy, as the continuation of the Roman little horn power, is also the beast in its final form. Conscious that, in the pages of this book, I am preparing to step into what some little Seasonists regard as disputed territory even by bringing up historical events beyond the 70 AD mark, lest any of them might shut their ears to whatever I might say, I raise this white flag now. Little Seasonism does not necessarily deny that historical events occurred, but rather when they occurred. Based on the statements of Mr. Jack, who is self-admittedly influenced by Anatoly Fomenko's conclusions, records of events that did once occur were loosely duplicated to fill in gaps created by false time added later to the timeline. Therefore, it seems reasonable that we can speak of a series of genuine, foundational events without arousing controversy. There seems to be a good consensus that the first 1,000 years of church history after about 70 AD constituted the prophesied millennium. Hopefully, this will be enough to get started, and by the time mention is made of events after that, my readers will have come to appreciate why the observations should be considered critically.